Uh, Hi, my name is Damian Madre, and I'm co-hosting with Vika Victoria. And Yeah, today we're here. Why are we here? To frame this up, this is really to have a conversation about what is happening in our society today, as we're all either aware of, have been aware of, and for me, what I wanted to have is this conversation around privilege and how that has been contributing to creating the systemic oppression that we have been witnessing and experiencing. Um, as this has become more of an important topic in our world, what I started to think about is the fact that what we need to be doing in society is accept the privilege that we've been experiencing and how that privilege has been constituting or contributing to a system that creates systemic oppression. Um, and it is important to acknowledge that and connect with that as a fundamental truth in order to become more meaningful allies in this movement and in this conversation about what needs to be done to change the systems that we're within. And so today that's what we wanted to talk a little bit more about and have a conversation. And I'm here with Vika, who I would love to share a little bit about her background, and you'll get a little bit more of my background as well. But I wanted to pass it off to Vika so you can get a sense of how she's looking at it and thinking about it as well.
Thank you, Damian. It's Damian and I have been friends for many, many years, and we came together about 2 weeks ago to have an action plan on how we can join forces with our respective background because Damian is an incredible experienced designer, bringing people together, and I am, I'd say, a conversation catalyst. So I'm a Soviet-born storyteller, educator, and facilitator, and where I see the beauty of growth is in the toughest conversations. And so I've been facilitating really hard conversations for several years. And when I imagine how we can approach what's happening right now, my theory is that it happens in 3 stages. And I want to just share that with you. So the first stage is the awareness. Maya Angelou said, when we know better, we do better. So when we become aware of all of the ways in which we knowingly and unknowingly have benefited from our privilege, have perpetuated the systemic injustice that is embedded into our culture, then we move into the second stage, which is acknowledgement. And when you can acknowledge something, the shame, the guilt, the fear, the sabotage dissipates because now you're in a space of understanding. And when you're understanding and acknowledging what's happening, that catapults you into the third stage, which is action. And this action is not performative allyship. It's not just posting a black square or getting really excited about this movement for a week, but it's the commitment to the marathon ahead. It's the understanding that if I am a human being operating from a place of my highest intelligence and highest integrity, then I stand for all human rights. And right now, the people that are being persecuted most severely and blatantly in our society are Black lives. So I'm taking a stand every day to amplify Black voices, to show up in my places of privilege and extend them into the Black community, to stand up to those who are either uneducated or willfully ignorant in my workspace, in my family, in my community. And it's going to take all of us doing those micro steps every day consistently for the tides to change so that our children will look back on this the same way we look back on the civil rights movement and go, I can't believe that happened. I can't believe there were black water fountains and white water fountains, because what's happening in this country right now is truly unbelievable. And so the mission that Damian and I have, the intention for this session, is to leave you all with a sense of hope and tangible ways that you can contribute. And the way that we are going to talk about that is by going in the order of operations and talking about, you know, step one, which is the awareness. So we've got several more people joining. Thank you so much. And so I would just want to share a story about my awareness, because, you know, we are students and teachers in the same breath. So I have been having very long conversations with my Black friends, with my white friends, to understand the things that I can't understand. My background is European. My ancestors were not slave bearing. I come from, you know, an oppressed people in my own right. And yet I recognize that by virtue of having light skin, I am white identifying. And I have experienced the privilege of that throughout my whole life. And so what we'd like for each of you to do is just, like, let's take a moment and just think, if you have a piece of paper next to you or a journal, how do you define privilege? And I'm going to ask this to Damian in 2 minutes. So take 2 minutes and just write down, how do you define privilege? And what we'd like to do is incorporate group participation. So if you have written it down and feel good about it, want to share it, go ahead and type it into the Zoom group chat box. How do you define privilege? Before we begin, I just wanted to set the container that this is going to be emotionally charged. We don't have a whole lot of time. People are jumping in and out. When I facilitate, there's very much like a guidelines, a safety, a breath work, a meditation. We don't have time for that. But you know what we do have time? We have time to breathe deeply together 3 times with smiles on our faces, looking at everyone on the screen as if they are the Starry Night painting. We are a bunch of dots that make up this gorgeous masterpiece. So if you will, please open up your palms, place them upside so that they're facing the sky, smiling at the screen, look right into that green dot and just smile and inhale deeply and exhale with your mouth open. Inhaling deeply, exhaling. Inhaling all the hope that you have for the future of humanity. Exhaling all the fear and shit that's holding us back. And now we're gonna high five each other. So put your hands out to the side. See that? We got a universal high five. It's so corny, but it's so good. All right, beautiful. So I don't know where Damian disappeared to. Oh, there he is. So Damian, I would love to hear what your definition of privilege is. And then because y'all can't participate with us in verbal form, we're going to start talking about all these different definitions. And Damian and I are kind of conversation artists. Like we've gone into it for hours under the Kenyan sun. So thank you for giving us your ideas, and we will build on top of those as foundations. Damian, how do you define privilege? I'm curious.
It's very simple for me. It's really like access. So privilege is really when a group of people have access to something that others don't. And the reason I like that very simple definition of it is because it's applicable to like different groups, right? I think, you know, people of color in terms of like what they don't have access to, which, for example, someone posted the benefit of the doubt, right? It's something as simple as that. Like people of color, it's an instant assumption into the negative versus the benefit of the doubt. And it's really simple things like that that I think gives, you know, white people this sort of like leverage and advantage in society that we don't often like look at because it's so microscopic, right? And it goes across like, oh, that's not a big deal. But it is a big deal if in my life and in my existence, I have to like constantly be aware of that. And it takes up like cognitive space in my mind. And that is an unfair reality for a group of people to live in, whilst in another reality, a group of people don't have that, that sort of like oppressive existence of always having to be concerned about not being given, you know, the benefit of the doubt. So I think it really comes down to like access for me. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's access and opportunities. And it's also, I saw that Cooper wrote, it is the benefit of the doubt. It's all the times in which we get to cheat the system of law because of the inherent things that we can't control, like the color of our skin. It's the times that I've gotten off on a speeding ticket because I was a cute white girl. And if a black friend had been sitting in that same driver's seat, he may have gotten killed. It's those moments where there was a thread the other day about a white woman who talked about all the times in which she had shoplifted or had encounters with the law, and how cops almost coddled her and gave her no penalty and no charges. And so I think it's the ingrained perception privileges that affords you benefit of the doubt, access, and opportunities in ways that create massive holes and disparities between people. So to me, privilege is violence. One of my favorite philosophers, Krishnamurti, Jiddu Krishnamurti, said that violence is born at the moment of otherness amongst men. And so to me, privilege is that manifestation of violence when we tell one people, not with our words, but really with our actions, that you are going to have more access, more opportunities, and more good graces simply because you were born into this skin color. That is privilege.
Mm-hmm. And to like add on that is like one of the things I love to get into is like, let's just say for a second we can try an experiment and we collectively agree on what privilege is, as we just shared about it, and most of what I'm seeing here aligns with what people are sharing. Now, if we accept that as a universal truth, going to Vika's point, to your point about acceptance, what is the exercise that we're doing in our daily lives, in our daily practice, that brings awareness to connect with how we're enjoying that privilege, right? Because I think that's the truth, where I see when people want to interact with this movement and get into the conversation, there's a knee-jerk reaction to go do things and donate. And what I feel, where I feel the conversation needs to be happening is also internal. So there's sort of like an external doing, and then there's an internal doing. And the internal doing is the inner work of connecting in with this universal fact of being like, okay, so privileges, lack of access, and a group of people haven't had access to things that I've been accessing for my entire life, and to connect with that as a truth, and what emotions come with that when you connect with it. Because when you connect with it, you can actually feel the emotions. And those emotions might be guilt, it might be shame, it might be anger, it might be frustration. And then the idea is to move through those emotions, not dwell or wallow in, but take the lessons that those emotions are giving. Because in our society, shame and guilt get like treated as this like negative thing. And speaking of Krishnamurti, he talks about like being in relationship. And so when we have emotions, we're being in relationship with the emotions, and therefore in relationship with ourselves. So if we can feel and experience what emotions come up when we connect with the fact that the privilege that we've been enjoying has been constituting to an oppressive system, to a group of people, and move through that, then I feel we get to a place of being better allies. And what Vika and I and a group of experience designers have been working on is really creating a framework, a facilitated guided experience that allows us to hold that conversation with ourselves, but as a collective, so we can do the work together and have the conversation together. And so part of it, we can talk about privilege and what it is. And just basically looking at this chat here, I can see that we all like collectively agree on what privilege is, which is great. So if we collectively agree on it, how can we take the next step forward to like move on from the talking of what is privilege and really getting on with it, as Alan Watts would say, like, let's just get on with it, you know? And so that's the work I'm really interested in, is people connecting with the truth. And we just have to like face it. So that's kind of like my take on privilege.
Yeah, thank you, Damian. As a thought experiment, I invite everyone just for a minute to close your eyes and bring yourself to the moment when you first recognized that you had privilege.
Mm-hmm.
It could have been a comment someone made. It could have been a time you got in trouble and got away with it. Bring to mind that moment that you recognized your own privilege. How did it feel in your body? How old were you? Did you tell anyone? And what did it make you feel? And then if you're willing to share in the chat box any part of that experience, the situation, or how it made you feel, what we're hoping for is to see enough trends around privilege to move to the second space of the process, which is acknowledgement. Yeah, shame is one of the most pervasive emotions. A lot of the work I do is on modern manhood. And shame is insidious and it becomes a spiral that pulls us down. And so, what I have noticed inside of even my family and my dearest friends is that there is this paralysis of privilege that is anchored by shame. Because in order to acknowledge that we have benefited from white privilege, we must be willing to face the shame and then walk through it, not around it. And that becomes a very challenging thing. Is anybody else willing to share how they felt when they first experienced their privilege?
Yes.
Yeah, shock.
And I think what happens is, as you know, thank you so much for everyone who's sharing this, because it's very vulnerable and takes courage. So I acknowledge that. And the thing about these emotions is we're quick to label it as negative, and something bad, and we shy away from it, and we try to like move around it or move past it or just ignore it. But I really do think that these emotions are really pointing to what we can do better, you know, together as a society. It points to like how we can show up better. And so if we listen to the emotions, then we can learn from it.
Yeah, we have, I just realized we have 75 people on this call. That's 75 people that are standing up and saying, I'm willing to do the uncomfortable thing of facing my shame, facing my shock, facing that I had power. And I was having a conversation with an older, I consider him a wise elder, and he said, man's highest pursuit is power. And that is where racism stems from. And that is where privilege stems from. That's where everything is about power. And so I think something also to address is that there's different degrees of privilege. There's privilege for just being a woman. There's privilege for being white identifying. There's privilege for a certain socioeconomic bracket. And so as we acknowledge these places of privilege, to me, the next step, as Damian was talking about, is like, okay, so how do you use your privilege? how do you use your privilege as a force of good in an unjust world? And there are so many incredible resources out there. And what I'm also finding is people are getting really inundated with resources. So beyond donating funds, which is really important, how do we recognize what's happening in our community, see where the underserved, underprivileged people are? What can you do to contribute, to support, to encourage and nurture the Black community inside your community? I reached out to the Boys and Girls Club that's right down the street in Santa Monica, because I know that they're working with those underserved communities. So it's about taking that awareness, moving into the acknowledgement of, shit, this really sucks. I feel really guilty. I feel powerful in a way that I didn't ask for. How can I transition into action? And Damian, I'm curious what you're seeing most effective when people are talking about using their privilege. What are some examples that you're really proud of or supporting?
What I'm proud of and see happening, and something that I've been speaking to in the past, is it's really simple, which is about I see people making the effort to diversify their perspectives, because that is what creates connection to people, other people's experiences. So a little context: I'm part of like a lot of different communities, and a lot of these communities are predominantly white, and in those communities, these conversations come up, and everyone asks, okay, what do we do about, you know, diversifying the group, and what do we do about diversifying the community? And I'm like, well, you have this whole thing. You want to create a system, and you want to create programs and all these kind of things to diversify the group. But the simplest thing that you could do is actually diversify your own friend group. So if your personal group, in terms of like who you're socializing with, is diverse, then the inevitable result of that is going to be diversification of the communities that you're in. Because when those communities are like, oh, who do we invite to this experience, or who do we invite to talk here, you have a diverse group that you can point to those people and be like, oh, this is my friend, he does this amazing work, and it just so happens that he's a person of color, right? Or she's a person of color. Instead of it being this thing where you have to like go out and look for the person of color to bring in, which becomes this whole tokenized concept, which is not a great experience for a Black person in a community. So the thing that I can see is really getting up, walking across the aisle, and diversifying your friend group. And the reason why I'd say that you ought to get up and walk across the aisle is because we have to consider that these Black people for 400 years and more have been in an oppressive system. So it's pretty hard to expect them to get up and walk across the aisle and say hi. So where I see good allies is the people who are making the effort to get up and move across the aisle and diversify their friend groups. I feel like that's something that we can all really be practically doing in our everyday from today.
Okay, everybody. So we have about 9 more minutes, and I want to open up Q&A for our speakers, Vika and Damian. And we have actually a first question from Cooper. How do you diversify your friend group without tokenizing anyone?
I'd love to answer that. Well, I think you do that by not necessarily going out and approach it in this way of like, I'm trying to diversify my friend group and meet people of color, but take a different approach where it's like, I'm going to diversify my experiences, right? And so if you think about it from like your own experiential, reality, and you say, okay, cool, maybe I'm going to go to OK Africa, which is an African music festival, and there's like really dope content there. That's an experience, and you're going to be immersed in that experience. But what's going to happen is you're going to connect to people of color through that experience. And that's the best way for connection to happen. how we connect with people is through shared experiences. So think about it more from an experiential standpoint. And what that means is how can you put yourself in different experiences, different situations that as a result will inevitably connect you to different perspectives. And what that means is that those perspectives doesn't necessarily have to be people of color only, because the whole idea of diversifying your friend group is diversifying from age, from gender, from people of color, from socioeconomic class. The more we can do that, and the more perspectives we can have, then the more shared connection that we can create in our society, and there will be more compassion and there will be more understanding. And all of these things that we're trying to do will come naturally and will come inevitably as a result of that, I think.
Thank you, Damian. And we have another question from Ariel, or Ariel. I apologize, I butchered anyone's name. How do we interrupt really white spaces at work? Like, what tactics do we use? One-on-one combos, calling it out in the moment?
I'll take that one. I just went through this. It's so valuable, instead of calling it out, calling it forward. Your approach, your tone, your gesticulation, all of that is going to be so important in this deeply uncomfortable and deeply necessary conversation. So when you're experiencing this in a white space at work, lead with curiosity. People get really thrown off if, instead of being called out, they get asked deeper questions than they were anticipating, because what you're disrupting is the implicit bias inside of themselves that they don't even realize. And if you do it in a very almost like childlike curiosity, like, oh, I'm curious, what did you mean by that statement? And then ask another question, and then really help them, almost by guiding them with breadcrumbs, to unpack what they actually meant. And then you can ask, I wonder, is that something that personally happened to you, or is this a story that you've taken on from your family or from your culture? And I do think that it is important to call people forward in public spaces lovingly and compassionately, because if we don't, A, you don't know who else in that circle was feeling the same exact way but didn't have the courage to say it out loud. And B, you don't know who else in that circle just totally washed over that comment and is operating from their own implicit bias and doesn't realize that this was wrong. So especially with the climate that's happening right now, it's kind of like what happened with Me Too. It just became completely unacceptable to talk to women a certain way. And it's on all of us to make it very clear that it is unacceptable to be not just, I'm not racist, you've got to be anti-racist. And when I feel like this happens a lot, especially in older generations, where they were conditioned from a young age, quote, not to see color. That is a very flawed statement. Are you aware of that? And can I share something that several of my Black friends educated me on? So coming at it from the perspective of, hey, I'm learning too, and this is what the education is showing me.
Thank you. Oh, Damien, did you have something to add?
No.
Okay, so we have one question from Julian. This is actually for people who have clients. How can we get our clients to see their own privilege and use it for change?
I think a lot of what Vika said applies there. And in terms of like, once a client, I mean, it's usually tricky with clients because there's a whole other layers to consider there from a business economic standpoint and all of that. But I think I'm a product designer, and I'll tell you what I've been doing. I work at I do brand development at a company that creates women product. And as a designer, what I've been doing is in the creative process, and I think this is where you actually can tap into people's clients' privilege and using it for good. I would basically tap into the companies, the brand, and what I know they want as an outcome. And I would essentially use that to make a point of like, well, how are we portraying ourselves with women? How are we diversifying? I think that's something that we ought to consider and think about. And we also have to think about our product reaches millions, millions of women, really, we're putting it in front of. So everything that we put out there is a statement towards equity in terms of how we're treating, people of color. And so in that creative process is when I actually get to say my 2 cents, and I connect it to what the overall brand and the project wants as an outcome. So in a way, it's a little bit of a balancing act that I am doing personally with that client, of thinking about what I want to see in terms of diversity and creating diverse perspectives within the company and as a brand for the company, and connecting it in that creative process. Because in the creative process, I find that clients are more willing to listen. Like, that's the space where everyone's like receptive and open to anything, because it's just a process that allows for that. So that's how I leverage it. And that's how I connect clients to their privilege and how they can be using it.
Thank you, Damian.
I just wanted to jump in. I know that there's a lot of questions, and I was just thinking this might be worth doing. If you want to type in every single question that you have, what Damian and I will commit to is doing an Instagram live and continuing to talk about this. So go ahead and feel free to type in these questions, because I believe that the questions are the clues. The things that you're most curious about are not a coincidence. So feel welcome to flood the chat with every single question you have on this topic, and we'll include our social handles, and you'll get more information when we'll do another live. Does that sound good?
Yes.
Cool.
And we will close out with one last question, and we'll have maybe just kind of an overall summarized thought, which is from Glow. How should we approach people whose ignorance is matched by their stubbornness or unwillingness to change? Speaking specifically about white family of older generations, is it worth pushing the subject, or are there lost causes?
I'll take this one. I've had some really tough conversations within my family. And what you recognize is that you are likely not going to change a person who has been conditioned over 4, 5, 6 decades on their thought process. What you can do is lead with curiosity and compassion. You lead with curiosity to understand their perspective. How is it possible that you could come from the same blood but see the same situation so differently? And the next thing is, after that curiosity, follow it with compassion, that given the era that they were born into, they did the best they could with the tools they had. They don't have what we have right now. They weren't in these conversations, and it is a shame. And the best thing that I have found that I can do is be unapologetic in my activism and in my non-optical allyship. So I went to protest, and my mom rolled her eyes. And when I explained why that meant something to me, I'm not expecting for her to support or encourage me. I'm just expecting her to understand that her daughter is following a different path than she chose. It's a very tough conversation, but here's what I've learned. If you become accusatory, they'll become defensive. So it's a dance, and you just have to have enough emotional intelligence to understand what are the ways that you can push and pull. Second thing, speak in metaphor. You know your family better than anyone. So if you're trying to talk about issues that they don't agree with, bring it back to a metaphor in their life that they do agree with. Try to get them to be imagining themselves in a position where they would be discriminated against. And only then, through that metaphor, can you really connect to them in a way that they'll understand it inside their own lens.
Beautiful.
Okay, everybody, we're going to go ahead and go back to our live stream. So please, I will give everybody the link here.